Children of alcoholics, are you okay? Growing up, I thought it was normal that my parents kept special cups in the car for their driving juice, and that sometimes we had to pull over so Daddy could take a nap on the side of the highway. My parents drank all day, every day, but I didn't know that wasn't how all parents lived. Mom would pour orange juice and special vitamins for breakfast that made her laugh at everything. Dad kept a flask in his cop uniform that he called his partner. They'd load me into the car with their travel mugs full of whatever they were drinking that day. Mom would sing along to the radio while swerving between lanes. Dad would drive with one eye closed because he said it helped him focus better. When I turned 10, I finally understood what it meant when adults had too much to drink. I started begging them to stop driving after they'd been drinking. Please just call an Uber, I'd say when they'd grab their keys after dinner. Mom would just ruffle my hair and laugh. Sweetheart, we know our limits. 2 glasses of wine is nothing, but it was never 2 glasses. It was the whole bottle plus the vodka from lunch plus the beer from breakfast. Dad would get annoyed when I tried to hide their keys. I'm a cop, he'd say. I know when someone's too impaired to drive. Trust me, kiddo, we're fine. Then he'd back straight into the mailbox on the way out. The accidents started piling up, but nothing ever happened to them. Dad would flash his badge when we got pulled over, and suddenly the other cops would be laughing and letting us go with a warning. We hit a parked car at the grocery store, and Dad just left a note that said, "Sorry," with a fake phone number. Mom drove us into a ditch one night and told me it was because a deer jumped out, even though I never saw any deer. The worst was when Dad ran a red light with me in the back seat, and we got T-boned by a minivan. The other driver's arm was broken. Dad told his cop buddies that the other guy ran the light, and somehow that became the official report. When Mom got pregnant, I thought maybe they'd stop drinking for the baby. Instead, they threw a party to celebrate and got so wasted Dad drove the car through our garage door. After my little sister was born, it got even worse. They'd put her car seat in the back next to me while they sipped from their flasks at red lights. One time, Mom was so buzzed she forgot to buckle the car seat in, and it slid across the back seat when she took a turn too fast. The baby screamed for 20 minutes while Mom laughed and said, "She's got strong lungs." I started buckling my sister and myself and holding the car seat steady with my hands. Then came the announcement that made my blood run cold. We were going on a family road trip to Vegas. 10 hours of driving through the desert, Dad said excitedly. We'll take turns at the wheel so we can both enjoy our drinks. Mom was already planning which bottles to pack in the cooler. Vegas isn't for kids, I said desperately. What are we even gonna do there? Mom waved me off. The hotel has a pool. You can watch your sister while Daddy and I hit the casinos. I pictured them driving impaired through the desert with no cell service, maybe rolling the car down a ravine where no one would find us for days. My baby sister would die strapped in her car seat. That's when I knew I had to do something drastic. I watched YouTube videos about cars until I found what I needed. The morning of the trip, while my parents were passed out from their Saturday night binge, I went into the garage with Dad's toolbox. I crawled under the car and found the spark plug wires like the video showed. My hands shook as I pulled them loose and shoved them in my pocket. Then I disconnected something called the starter relay that the video said would make the engine not turn over at all. I even drained half the oil for good measure and hid the bottles behind the lawnmower. I put all the tools back exactly where I found them and flushed the spark plug wires down the toilet piece by piece. The hours before we were supposed to leave felt like days. My parents loaded up the car with their cooler full of beer and vodka. Dad told me to grab my sister's diaper bag. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they were going to hear it. What if they noticed something was wrong before they even tried to start it? What if they figured out it was me? Dad was a cop, and he already thought I was a liar who made up stories. Who was going to believe me over him? I could hear Mom calling my name. She wanted me to help load the car. My legs felt like jelly as I stood up. Dad's heavy footsteps were coming down the hallway toward my room, and then I heard him yell something to Mom about getting the keys so we could finally hit the road, and something about someone having messed with the car. I walked out of my room on shaky legs and headed toward the front of the house where I could hear Dad's voice getting louder. My baby sister was crying in her playpen, so I picked her up and held her against my chest, feeling her warm weight as some kind of shield. Through the living room window, I could see Dad standing in the driveway next to our car with the driver's door hanging open. He had his hands on his hips in that cop stance he does when he's about to get mean. Mom came stumbling out the front door with her travel mug in hand, the one she fills with vodka and orange juice that she calls a mimosa, even though it's mostly just vodka. She wobbled down the porch steps and across the driveway, asking what all the yelling was about. Dad pointed at the car and said someone messed with the engine, his voice going hard and flat like when he talks to suspects. My stomach felt like it was falling through the floor, even though this was exactly what I wanted to happen. I stood on the porch hugging my sister tighter, while Dad explained that the car wouldn't start, and something felt wrong about it. Mom laughed and suggested maybe we left a light on inside the car overnight. Dad shook his head and said no. This was different. This was something else. Dad climbed back into the driver's seat and turned the key again. The engine made this awful grinding sound like metal scraping against metal, a sick noise that went nowhere. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel and started swearing loud enough that I heard every word from the porch. Mom took a long drink from her mug and said, maybe it was just a dead battery from leaving the dome light on last week. Dad kept turning the key over and over, and each time the grinding sound got worse and more desperate. He punched the dashboard and yelled that this wasn't a dead battery. This was something wrong with the whole system. Mom shrugged and took another drink, swaying a little as she stood there in her pajamas and flip-flops. The baby started fussing in my arms, so I bounced her gently and made shushing sounds while watching Dad get angrier and angrier in the car. He finally gave up on the key and climbed back out, slamming the door so hard the whole car shook. Dad popped the hood and it rose up with a metallic groan. He leaned over the engine bay like he knew what he was looking for, squinting down at all the parts and wires. I could tell he'd been drinking since breakfast because his movements were sloppy, and he had to grab the edge of the hood to steady himself. But his cop training was still there underneath the alcohol, making him check things in this careful way that scared me more than the yelling did. He touched different parts of the engine with his fingers, tracing wires and checking connections. Mom stood behind him asking what he saw, and he told her to shut up so he could concentrate. I watched from the porch holding my sister tight, my heart beating so hard I thought everyone could probably hear it. Dad's hand moved toward the area where I disconnected the starter relay, and I stopped breathing for a second. He poked around that spot for what felt like forever before moving to check something else. My sister grabbed a handful of my shirt and made a gurgling sound, and I kissed the top of her head while watching Dad's methodical search through the engine. Dad straightened up from the engine and yelled my name so loud my sister started crying again. He told me to bring him the flashlight from the garage right now. I carried my sister inside first and put her back in the playpen with some toys, then went to the garage with shaking hands. The flashlight was hanging on its hook right next to where I'd taken Dad's toolbox down last night. I grabbed it and walked back outside, trying to make my face look confused and worried instead of scared he was going to figure out what I did. Dad snatched the flashlight from my hand and leaned back over the engine, shining the beam around at different parts. I stood there next to him watching the light move across wires and metal, my legs feeling like they might give out. He asked me if I heard anything weird last night, any sounds from the garage. I said no in a voice that came out too high and squeaky. He grunted and kept searching with the flashlight, the beam stopping on the exact spot where the starter relay should have been connected. I held my breath and waited for him to say something, but he just moved the light to a different area and kept looking. Mom walked back up to the porch, and I heard the sound of the cooler opening. She came back out with a fresh drink even though it was barely 9 in the morning, the ice cubes clinking in her cup. She laughed and said maybe this was a sign we shouldn't go to Vegas after all. Dad ignored her and announced he was calling his buddy who runs the garage down on 5th Street to come take a look. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts while Mom took a long drink and hummed along to some song in her head. I wanted to run back inside, but I knew that would look suspicious, so I just stood there trying to appear normal and helpful. Dad found the number and hit call, then started talking in his cop voice about how he needed someone to come check out his car right away. He mentioned it was urgent and used words like tampered with and possible criminal activity that made my stomach twist into knots. Mom rolled her eyes and said he was being dramatic, that cars just break sometimes. Dad shot her a look that made her stop talking and take another drink instead. I used Dad being distracted on the phone as my chance to escape inside. I scooped up my sister from the playpen and carried her to her room to change her diaper. She needed it anyway, but mostly I just wanted to get away from Dad's questions about who was in the garage last night. Through the window, I could see him pacing the driveway with his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand waving around as he talked. I knew he was calling Julian Corey from the garage because Dad always calls him when something's wrong with the car. Julian has fixed our car before after Dad backed into a pole in a parking lot, and another time after Mom drove over a curb and messed up the alignment. I changed my sister's diaper slowly, taking my time with the wipes and powder, watching Dad through the window the whole time. He was still pacing and talking, probably telling Julian about how someone sabotaged his car on purpose. My hands shook as I fastened the new diaper and picked my sister back up. She smiled at me and grabbed my nose, having no idea what was happening or what I'd done to keep her safe. The tow truck showed up in less than 30 minutes, which was way faster than normal. Dad must have used his cop voice and said it was urgent because Julian never comes that quick for regular customers. I watched from the living room window as the big truck backed into our driveway with its yellow lights flashing. Julian Corey climbed out of the cab wearing his garage uniform with his name stitched on the pocket. He greeted Dad with this friendly respect that people always give to police officers, shaking his hand and nodding while Dad talked. They both walked over to the car and leaned over the open hood together, Julian's head disappearing into the engine bay while Dad pointed at different things. Mom had gone inside by then and was making herself another drink in the kitchen, the blender running loud as she mixed up something with ice. I sat on the couch with my sister in my lap, watching the two men examine my sabotage work. Julian touched some wires and checked some connections, his movements quick and sure like someone who knows exactly what he's looking for. Dad stood next to him with his arms crossed, his cop face on as he watched Julian work. Julian poked around in the engine for a few more minutes, then stood up straight and wiped his hands on a rag from his pocket. He said something to Dad that I couldn't hear through the window, but I saw Dad nod and ask a question. Julian shrugged and pointed at different parts of the engine while he talked. Dad asked him something else and Julian shook his head, then said he'd need to tow the car to the shop to run proper tests on it. Dad agreed, but then asked Julian to give him a quick opinion on what might be wrong right now. I held my breath and squeezed my sister tighter, waiting for Julian to say the word sabotage out loud. My sister squirmed in my arms and made a whining sound, but I couldn't let her go, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch and wait. Julian scratched his head and said something that made Dad's shoulders relax a little bit. He wasn't pointing at the engine in an accusing way, or looking around like he was searching for evidence of a crime. He just looked like a mechanic explaining a normal car problem to a customer. Julian walked back to his tow truck and started pulling out the chains and hooks he needed. He said something about the starter or maybe the fuel system, but he'd know more once he got the car up on the lift at his shop. The tow truck's machinery made loud beeping sounds as Julian worked the controls, lowering the hook and attaching it to our car's frame. Dad stood watching with his hands in his pockets, not looking as angry as he did before. Mom came outside with her fresh drink and asked what the mechanic said. Dad told her it could be anything. Probably just something that broke on its own. The chains rattled as Julian winched our car up onto the truck bed, the front wheels lifting off the ground. I felt this wave of relief wash through me as I watched them load the car up. It was leaving, going away to Julian's shop, and that meant we couldn't drive to Vegas today. My sister reached up and patted my face with her chubby hand, and I kissed her fingers while watching the tow truck secure our car with more chains. Julian climbed back in the cab and gave Dad a wave, then drove away slowly with our car tilted up on the truck bed behind him. For a few seconds, I thought maybe I'd actually stopped the trip. Maybe we were safe. But then Mom turned to Dad and said, "Why don't we just rent a car so we can still make the trip?" Dad's whole face changed, lighting up like she'd just solved all his problems. He pulled out his phone again and said that was a great idea. He'd call the rental place near the airport right now. I felt my temporary relief disappear as I listened to Dad dial the number and start talking to someone about car rentals. He gave them his badge number and asked about police discounts, using his cop voice to sound official and important. Mom went back inside to start packing again, humming and sipping her drink like nothing had happened. I sat frozen on the couch with my sister, realizing I'd only bought us a few hours at most. Dad was going to rent a different car, and we were still going to drive to Vegas with him and Mom drinking the whole way. All that work I did last night, all that fear and planning, and it only delayed things by one morning. I looked down at my sister playing with my fingers and felt like crying, but I couldn't because Dad might see and ask questions. I just held her and tried to figure out what I was going to do next. I grabbed my stomach and doubled over on the couch, making a groaning sound that got Mom's attention from the kitchen. She turned around with her drink in hand and asked what was wrong, and I told her my stomach hurt really bad, like I might throw up. Mom walked over and felt my forehead with the back of her hand, her breath smelling like vodka even though it was barely noon. She said I didn't feel warm and asked if I ate something bad, and I shook my head and said I didn't know, but it really hurt. My sister started fussing in my arms, and I made a big show of checking her diaper, pulling back the waistband and making a face like I smelled something awful. I told Mom that my sister had diarrhea and it looked really bad, all runny and weird colored. Mom barely glanced over from her drink and waved her hand at me, telling me to just handle it and change her in the nursery. She said she had a headache and didn't want to deal with it right now, which was exactly what I expected her to say. I carried my sister upstairs to her room and actually did change her diaper, even though it was just regular baby poop, not diarrhea at all. I could hear Dad downstairs on the phone, his voice getting louder and more frustrated as he talked to someone at the rental place. When I came back down with my sister, Dad was pacing in the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. He kept saying things like, "Come on, and you gotta have something available," but whoever was on the other end wasn't giving him the answer he wanted. Finally, he hung up and threw his phone on the couch, looking angry and defeated at the same time. He announced that the rental place was almost out of cars because it was Sunday, and everyone was traveling, and the earliest they could guarantee a vehicle was Monday morning. I tried not to look relieved as he said we'd have to push the trip back a day, leaving Tuesday morning instead of today. Mom groaned from the kitchen and said this whole thing was turning into a disaster, but Dad told her it was fine, just one more day, and we'd be on the road. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out to see Julian's name on the caller ID. My heart started beating fast because I knew what he was probably calling about, and I tried to shove the phone back in my pocket before anyone noticed. But Dad's cop instincts were too quick, and he snatched the phone out of my hand before I could react. He answered it himself, saying hello in his official police voice, and I watched his face go from curious to suspicious to completely dark as he listened to whatever Julian was telling him. Dad walked into the other room still holding my phone to his ear, and I could hear him asking questions in a tone that made my stomach actually hurt for real this time. He came back a few minutes later and hung up, then stood there staring at the phone in his hand like it just told him something impossible. He announced that Julian said someone deliberately disconnected parts of the engine and drained the oil, that this wasn't just a car breaking down on its own. His cop instincts kicked in full force, and he started talking about checking the security cameras on the garage and figuring out who would want to sabotage our family trip. He paced around, making a list out loud of people who might have grudges against him, other cops he'd testified against, criminals he'd arrested, neighbors he'd had disputes with. Mom came out of the kitchen with a fresh drink and laughed, saying it was probably just neighborhood kids playing a prank. She said, "Remember last Halloween when those teenagers toilet papered the trees? This was probably the same kind of stupid kid stuff, but Dad wasn't buying it at all." He shook his head and said this was different. This took knowledge of cars and deliberate planning, not just random vandalism. He stormed inside toward the garage to check if we even had working cameras, and I knew we didn't because he'd been meaning to install them for months, but never got around to it. I heard him swearing in the garage as he realized there were no cameras, nothing that could tell him who'd been out there last night. I took the opportunity to sneak upstairs to my room with my sister, closing the door quietly behind me. I pulled out my old iPod from where I'd hidden it in my dresser drawer under some clothes. I opened the voice memo app and hit record, then started describing everything in a whisper. I talked about the drinking, the driving juice and the special cups, the time we got T-boned at the intersection, the flask in Dad's uniform, Mom forgetting to buckle the car seat. I explained why I disabled the car, how I was scared they'd drive us into the desert and we'd die in a crash with no one around to help. My hands shook as I saved the recording to a hidden folder I'd created weeks ago when I first started worrying about needing evidence. I opened the iPod's browser and logged into my email, then attached the voice memo and sent it to myself before Dad could think to confiscate all my devices. I deleted the sent email from the iPod and cleared the browser history, then shoved it back in the drawer under my clothes. Downstairs, I could hear Dad on the phone again, this time calling his cop buddies and asking if anyone saw suspicious activity in our neighborhood last night. I sat on my bed with my sister in my lap, listening to him work through his mental list of enemies and people who might have it out for a police officer. He called at least 5 different cops, describing what happened to the car and asking them to check their dash cams or patrol logs to see if they noticed anything weird on our street. The afternoon dragged on with Dad getting more and more frustrated as each call turned up nothing. Mom started making dinner around 5, and I could hear bottles clinking in the kitchen as she pulled out the wine. I went downstairs with my sister and found Mom cooking with a bottle in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other. She was drinking the wine straight from the bottle instead of pouring it in a glass, taking big gulps between stirring the pasta. My sister squirmed in my arms and reached for Mom, but I held her tighter because I could see Mom swaying a little as she moved around the kitchen. Mom nearly dropped my sister twice when she tried to take her from me, her hands clumsy and her grip too loose. The second time I saw my sister start to slip, I just took the baby back and said I'd feed her the bottle myself. Mom slurred something about how I was such a good big brother, always helping out and taking care of my little sister. She ruffled my hair and went back to her cooking, spilling sauce on the counter because her aim was off. I sat at the kitchen table and fed my sister her bottle while watching Mom stumble around making dinner. That night after we ate and my sister was asleep in her crib, I lay awake in my bed knowing I'd only bought us one day. Dad and Mom were already talking about leaving Tuesday morning instead, and the rental car would be ready by then. All that work I did, all that fear and planning, and it only delayed things by maybe 36 hours. I stared at the ceiling and realized I needed to tell someone what was really happening in this house. I couldn't stop them by myself anymore. I needed an adult who would actually listen and do something about it. Monday morning came too fast and I got ready for school feeling exhausted and scared. Dad drove me in his patrol car, and the whole ride he kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror like he was trying to read my mind. At the school I went through the motions of homeroom, barely hearing anything the teacher said. When she asked if anyone needed anything, I raised my hand and said I needed to see the counselor. My teacher wrote me a pass to Madeline Gray's office without asking any questions, maybe because I looked as tired and stressed as I felt. I walked down the empty hallway to the counselor's office with the pass clutched in my sweaty hand. The waiting area outside Madeline's door had those plastic chairs that squeak when you move, and a table covered in magazines about college that I was way too young to care about. I sat down and picked at a loose thread on my backpack, while the clock on the wall ticked so loud it felt like everyone in the building could hear it. Every time footsteps came down the hall, I tensed up thinking it might be Dad somehow knowing I was here. 20 minutes felt like 20 hours while I sat there practicing what I was going to say in my head. The words kept getting jumbled up and nothing sounded right. How do you tell someone your parents are drunk all the time without sounding like you're making it up or being dramatic? The door finally opened, and Madeline stood there with this kind smile that made me want to cry before I even said anything. She asked what was on my mind, and I almost stood up and ran back to class right then. My legs actually started to move like my body wanted to escape before my brain could stop it. But then I thought about my sister in that car seat sliding across the back seat, and I made myself stay put. I followed Madeline inside, and the door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly the room felt really small. She sat down behind her desk, and I took the chair across from her, my hands shaking so bad I had to sit on them. I opened my mouth to start explaining, and nothing came out at first. Then everything came rushing out in this jumbled mess about the driving juice and the special vitamins and how they drink all day every day. I told her about the flask in Dad's uniform and the travel mugs in the car and how Mom swerves between lanes while singing. The words kept pouring out faster and messier, and then I was crying and I couldn't stop. I told her about the time we got hit at the intersection, and Dad lied to his cop friends about what happened. Madeline just listened without interrupting me or telling me to slow down. Her face got more serious as I kept talking. She asked how often this happens and whether I feel safe at home. I wiped my nose on my sleeve and told her it happens every single day, and I don't feel safe when they're driving us around drunk. I pulled out my iPod from my backpack with shaking hands. I'd been taking pictures for weeks just in case I ever got brave enough to tell someone. I showed her the photos of empty bottles piled in the recycling bin with timestamps from different days. There were pictures of Dad's flask sitting on the kitchen counter next to his badge. I had a photo of Mom pouring vodka into her orange juice at breakfast, with my sister's high chair visible in the background. Madeline's expression changed from concerned to alarmed as she scrolled through the pictures. I could see her understanding that this wasn't just one bad day or one mistake. This was every day. This was how we lived. She handed the iPod back to me and explained that she's required by law to report this to someone called Child Protective Services. I felt panic shoot through my whole body. I started begging her not to tell anyone because Dad would know it was me who talked. He was already suspicious about the car, and if CPS showed up, he'd put it all together. Madeline promised she'd be careful about how she made the report, but she was really clear that she had no choice. She had to report it today. She wrote something on a card and slid it across the desk. She told me if I ever needed to signal that I was unsafe, I should use the word pineapple, and someone would know to help me. She wrote her cell phone number on the card, and I shoved it deep into my shoe where Dad would never think to look. The bell rang for next period, and I stood up feeling like I just jumped off a cliff with no idea what was at the bottom. Madeline touched my shoulder and told me I was brave, but I didn't feel brave. I felt like I just made the biggest mistake of my life. I walked back to class in a fog. The rest of the school day passed in this weird blur where I couldn't focus on anything the teachers were saying. I kept imagining CPS showing up at my house with clipboards and questions. I pictured Dad's face when he realized I was the one who told. Every time someone called my name, I jumped. When the final bell rang, I grabbed my stuff and headed for the bus loop like normal. But Dad's patrol car was sitting right there in the pickup lane. He never picked me up from the school. I always took the bus. My stomach dropped as I walked over and climbed into the back seat behind the metal divider. Dad pulled out of the school parking lot really slowly. He drove through the neighborhood taking weird turns that weren't the way home. He asked about my day in this casual voice that didn't match the way his eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror to watch my face. I told him it was fine. He asked what I learned in class and I said stuff. He asked if anything interesting happened and I said no. The whole time my heart was beating, so hard I thought he could probably hear it. Dad started talking about how Internal Affairs sometimes investigates cops based on anonymous tips. He said people who want to cause trouble for police officers will call in fake complaints. He explained how these investigations can ruin a cop's career even when there's no proof of anything wrong. He said good cops need to stick together and not believe lies from outside people who don't understand what police work is really like. I stared out the window at the houses going by and gave one-word answers. Yeah. Okay, sure. I realized he was warning me. He was telling me not to talk to anyone about our family. He pulled into our driveway but didn't turn off the engine right away. He just sat there with his hands on the steering wheel. Then he said, "Family loyalty is the most important thing in the world." He said a cop's family especially needs to stick together because lots of people out there want to see cops fail. He turned around to look at me through the divider and asked if I understood what he was saying. I nodded and got out of the car as fast as I could. Inside the house, Mom already had music playing loud from the kitchen speakers, and she was spinning around with my sister in her arms singing along to some pop song. The baby was giggling, but Mom's movements were sloppy and too fast for someone holding an infant. She twirled near the dining table and her foot caught on the chair leg. I saw her start to tip sideways, and I jumped up from the couch where I'd been sitting and lunged forward. My hands caught my sister just as Mom stumbled into the table edge. The baby didn't even cry because I had her safe against my chest, while Mom laughed and said something about being clumsy today. I didn't say anything back. I just took my sister into the living room and sat down with her in my lap, while Mom poured herself another drink and kept dancing by herself in the kitchen. The clock on the wall said it was almost 7, and I kept thinking about whether Madeline had made that call yet to CPS. Every time a car drove past outside, I tensed up wondering if this was it. Then someone knocked on the front door. Dad answered it, and I heard a woman's voice say her name was Sheila Phillips, and she was with Child Protective Services. She said she was here to do a welfare check based on a report the agency received. My whole body went cold. Dad's voice changed completely into this professional, friendly cop tone, and he said, "Of course, please come in. We're happy to cooperate with any questions you might have." He shot a look at Mom that made her stop mid-sip of her drink. Mom's eyes went wide, and suddenly she wasn't stumbling anymore. She walked straight into the kitchen, and I heard bottles clinking as she shoved them into cabinets and under the sink. Sheila stepped inside, and she had a clipboard and a badge clipped to her belt. She smiled at me in this kind way and asked if I was okay. I nodded because I couldn't make words come out. Dad stood next to Sheila, explaining how we're a normal family, and he's a police officer, so he knows the importance of following rules and keeping kids safe. Sheila started walking through our house, looking at everything and taking notes on her clipboard. Dad followed her around, giving explanations for everything she looked at. She asked to see where the baby sleeps, and Dad showed her the nursery upstairs where the crib was set up. Sheila checked that the crib met safety standards and asked when my sister's last doctor appointment was. Dad pulled up the information on his phone, acting helpful and cooperative. Sheila went to the kitchen and opened our fridge, checking that we had food. She looked at the smoke detectors on the ceiling and asked Dad when he last changed the batteries. Dad said he checks them every month as part of his routine because safety is a priority in a cop's household. Mom stood in the corner of the kitchen with her arms crossed, looking sober and worried. Sheila asked Mom questions about my sister's feeding schedule and sleep routine. Mom answered everything perfectly, like she wasn't the same person who almost dropped the baby 5 minutes ago. Sheila wrote everything down on her clipboard and asked to speak with me privately for a moment. Dad tensed up, but he nodded and said, "Of course, whatever you need to do your job." Sheila took me into the hallway near the stairs and knelt down, so we were at eye level. She asked me if I felt safe at home and if there was anything I wanted to tell her. I looked past her at Dad, who was standing in the doorway watching us, even though Sheila said privately. I said everything was fine. Sheila looked at me for a long moment, and I could tell she knew I was lying, but she also knew why. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card with her name and phone number printed on it. She handed it to me and made eye contact in this way that told me she understood I was the one who spoke up. She said she wanted me to keep this card somewhere safe and call her if I ever needed anything. Then she stood up and told my parents in a louder voice that she'd be scheduling a follow-up visit later this week to check in again. Dad walked her to the door, still acting friendly and professional, thanking her for doing such important work protecting children in the community. The second the door closed behind Sheila, Dad's whole face changed. The friendly cop mask disappeared and his jaw got tight and his eyes went hard. He turned around and demanded to know who called CPS on us. His voice wasn't loud, but it had this edge that made me want to run. Mom started crying immediately, saying this was going to ruin his career, and what were they going to do if Internal Affairs found out about this? Dad told her to shut up and think. He paced back and forth in the entryway, trying to figure out who would report us. He listed off neighbors we'd had problems with and teachers at my school, and even some of his cop buddies who might have grudges. I kept my face completely blank and still, even though my heart was beating, so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Dad looked at me and asked if I told anyone at the school about our family. I said no. He asked if any teachers had been asking me weird questions lately. I said no again. He stared at me for another few seconds, then grabbed his keys and said he was going out to think. After Dad left, Mom went straight for the cabinet where she'd hidden the bottles earlier. She poured a big glass of vodka and sat at the kitchen table, crying into her hands. I went upstairs to my room and closed the door. Dad would probably search my room soon, looking for evidence of who made the call. I needed to move everything important before he thought to look. I pulled out my phone and saw I had messages from friends, but I didn't open them because Dad was going to take my phone away. I spent the next 10 minutes forwarding all my photos and voice recordings to my email account. I sent copies to 3 different email addresses just to be safe. Then I deleted all the evidence from my phone and cleared the trash folder and the sent items folder. When Dad came back an hour later, he came straight to my room without knocking. He held out his hand and said, "Give me your phone." I handed it over without arguing. He said it was for my own good until we figured out who was spreading lies about our family. He said someone was trying to destroy us and we needed to stick together. I said okay. He took my phone and left my room, and I heard him going through it downstairs. That night, after my parents finally went to bed, I waited until I heard Dad snoring. Then I got up and went to my closet where I kept my old game console that I didn't use anymore. I'd hidden an SD card inside it months ago when I first started getting really worried about my parents drinking. I opened up the console and found the card still tucked inside where I'd left it. I pulled out my iPod that I kept hidden under my mattress and plugged in the SD card using an adapter. I transferred all the new photos and voice memos from my iPod onto the SD card. Then I took the card out and looked around my room trying to think of a new hiding place. Dad knew about all my usual spots. I went to my bed and found a small rip in the seam of the mattress near the bottom corner. I pushed the SD card deep inside the rip and then smoothed the fabric back down so you couldn't tell anything was there. I put everything else back where it belonged and got back in bed. I didn't sleep much that night, thinking about Sheila's visit and what would happen next. Tuesday morning, I woke up to Dad and Mom talking in loud voices downstairs. I got dressed and went down to find them both holding their travel mugs, even though it was barely 8 in the morning. Dad announced they were going to the store to pick up supplies and they'd be back in an hour. I asked if I could come with them, but Dad said no. Just stay here and watch your sister. They grabbed their keys and walked out to the rental car Dad had picked up yesterday. I watched through the window as they backed out of the driveway, both of them sipping from their mugs. I knew those mugs had more than coffee in them. I picked up my sister from her playpen and held her close, hoping they wouldn't hurt anyone while they were out driving around. I checked my iPod and saw it was 8:15. I sent a quick message to Madeline from my email account saying my parents just left to go shopping and they were both drinking. An hour later, I heard the rental car pull into the driveway. I looked out the window and saw Dad and Mom getting out, both of them laughing about something. They had shopping bags in their hands that clinked with the sound of glass bottles. Dad opened the back door to grab more bags, and that's when I saw my sister's car seat. She was still strapped in it and she was awake and fussy, her face red from crying. I ran outside and yanked open the car door. The inside of the car was hot even though it wasn't a super warm day. They'd left her in there the whole time they were shopping. I unbuckled my sister and pulled her out, feeling how sweaty she was. Mom walked past carrying bags and said something about how the baby was fine. Stop being so dramatic. I carried my sister inside and gave her water from her sippy cup. She drank it fast like she was really thirsty. I changed her diaper and tried to calm her down while my parents unpacked their bottles in the kitchen, still laughing about whatever happened at the store. That afternoon, I went up to my room and pulled out my iPod from under the mattress. I opened my email and saw a new message from the garage with an attachment. The subject line said car inspection report, and my hands started shaking as I opened it. Julian had written everything out in detail about the disconnected starter relay and the missing spark plug wires and the drained oil. The report said the damage was deliberate and showed knowledge of engine systems. I could hear Dad downstairs on the phone with someone from work, and his voice was getting louder. He kept saying things like someone knew exactly what they were doing, and this wasn't random vandalism. I closed the email and shoved the iPod back under my mattress, my heart beating so fast I thought I might throw up. Dad came upstairs and I heard him walk past my room to the bathroom. The shower turned on a minute later and I knew this was my only chance. I grabbed the iPod again and pulled up the email with Julian's report. I opened the camera and took photos of the screen showing all the details about the sabotage. My hands were shaking so bad the first few pictures came out blurry, so I had to steady myself against the desk and try again. I got 3 clear shots of the report and then logged into the school portal on my iPod browser. I found Madeline's email address in the staff directory and started typing a message. I attached the photos and wrote that my parents were planning to rent a car tomorrow for the Vegas trip. I said they were still drinking every day and I was scared they were going to drive us into the desert and crash. I hit send and deleted the message from my sent folder and cleared my browser history. Then I put the iPod back in its hiding spot and went downstairs like nothing happened. Wednesday afternoon, I was doing homework at the kitchen table when the phone rang. Dad answered it and I heard him say hello in his friendly cop voice. His face changed after a few seconds and he said, "Oh, hey Sheila, thanks for calling back." I kept my head down pretending to focus on my math worksheet, but I was listening to every word. Dad explained that he had a work emergency come up and asked if they could reschedule the follow-up visit for Friday instead. There was a long pause while Sheila talked on the other end. Dad's voice got a little tighter as he said he understood this was important, but Friday would work much better for everyone. Another pause and then Dad said, "Great, we'll see you Friday afternoon around 3. He hung up and muttered something under his breath about CPS and their timing. I looked up and asked what that was about. Dad said nothing, just some follow-up stuff from that lady who came by. He told me to finish my homework and went outside to the garage. Through the window, I could see him pacing around talking on his cell phone, and I knew he was probably calling his cop friends to complain about CPS breathing down his neck. Mom spent the rest of Wednesday afternoon out by the pool with a drink in her hand. She had the baby monitor sitting on the table next to her lounge chair, but the volume was turned down, so low I could barely hear it when I walked past. I watched her from the kitchen window for a few minutes, and she didn't look at the monitor once. She just sipped her drink and scrolled through her phone, laughing at something on the screen. I went upstairs to check on my sister and found her awake in her crib making fussy noises. Her diaper was soaked through and had leaked onto her clothes. I changed her and gave her a bottle, and she calmed down after a few minutes. I sat in the rocking chair holding her and wondered how long she'd been awake crying before I came to check. Mom probably wouldn't have heard her even if the monitor was on full volume because she was too focused on her drink and her phone. I stayed with my sister until she fell asleep again and then carefully put her back in the crib. When I went back downstairs, Mom was still out by the pool on her 3rd or 4th drink, and the monitor was still sitting there on the table doing nothing. Thursday after school, I told Dad I needed to stay late for a study group. He looked suspicious for a second, but then said fine and told me to text when I was ready to be picked up. I walked to Madeline's office instead and knocked on her door. She smiled when she saw me and waved me inside. I sat down in the same chair as before, and she asked how things were going at home. I told her about Sheila rescheduling to Friday, and about Mom leaving the baby monitor turned down, and about Dad getting more paranoid about the car. Madeline listened and took notes on a yellow pad of paper. When I finished, she looked at me seriously and said we needed to talk about documentation. She explained that CPS needed to see patterns of behavior, not just single incidents. One time leaving the monitor down wasn't enough, but if it happened repeatedly, that showed neglect. One drunk driving trip wasn't enough, but multiple trips over time showed a dangerous pattern. She told me to start keeping track of dates and times and specific examples of my parents drinking and driving. She said to write down what they drank and when and where they drove and whether they had us kids in the car. I asked how I was supposed to remember all that, and she said to use my iPod to take notes with timestamps. She said the more specific I could be, the stronger the case would be for keeping us safe. Madeline pulled out a piece of paper and drew a simple map of our neighborhood. She pointed to a spot 3 blocks away and said that's where the fire station is. She told me I could go there any time, day or night, if I felt unsafe at home. The firefighters would help me and call the right people and make sure my sister and I were protected. She made me repeat the address back to her until I had it memorized. Then she reminded me about the code word we'd agreed on during our first meeting. She said if I ever needed to signal that I was in danger, but couldn't say it directly, I should use that word in a message or voicemail. She made me practice saying it out loud a few times, so it would come naturally if I needed it. She also made me memorize her cell phone number and quiz myself on it until I could recite it without looking. She said these were my safety tools, and I needed to know them by heart. I left her office feeling a little less alone, but also more scared because now everything felt more real and serious. Friday evening, Dad came home driving a silver rental car. He parked it in the driveway and came inside grinning like he'd won something. He announced that we were finally taking this trip and nothing was going to stop us this time. Mom cheered and opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. They started pulling out suitcases and packing clothes while my sister babbled in her playpen. I watched them load up a big cooler with ice and beer and vodka and wine. Dad kept making jokes about how much fun we were going to have, and Mom kept laughing and refilling her glass. I felt panic rising in my chest like a wave I couldn't stop. I'd sabotaged the car and told Madeline and talked to CPS and nothing had worked. They were still going to drive us into the desert while drinking, and there was nothing left I could do to stop them. My hands started shaking and I felt like I couldn't breathe right. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face and tried to think. Madeline had given me tools and a code word and a plan. I just needed to use them. I waited until my parents were both busy in the garage loading bags into the rental car. Then I grabbed the house phone and called Madeline's office number. It went to voicemail and I left a message using the code word we'd practiced. I said I needed help and used the word twice so she'd know it wasn't an accident. Then I hung up and snuck out the back door. I walked to the corner store 2 blocks away and asked if I could use their courtesy phone. The clerk looked annoyed but pointed to the phone on the wall. I dialed 911, and when the operator answered, I said I wanted to report a drunk driver. I gave our home address and described the silver rental car and said there would be 2 adults who'd been drinking with 2 kids in the car. The operator asked for my name and I hung up instead. I walked back home the long way so I wouldn't run into my parents. When I got there, Dad was yelling for me to get in the car. I grabbed my sister from her playpen and buckled her into her car seat. Mom climbed into the front passenger seat, already sipping from a travel mug. Dad got behind the wheel with his flask visible in the cup holder. I sat in the back, holding my sister's hand and praying the 911 call would work. Dad pulled out of the driveway and drove toward the main road. He made it exactly 4 blocks before I saw the red and blue lights flash behind us. A patrol car was signaling for us to pull over. Dad muttered something and pulled to the curb. My sister started crying in her car seat, and Mom giggled like this was all funny. The officer walked up to Dad's window and asked for license and registration. Dad reached for his wallet, and I saw him pull out his badge along with his license. He handed both to the officer and said, "Hey, brother, just heading out for a family trip." The officer looked at the badge and then looked at Dad more carefully. He asked Dad to step out of the vehicle, and they walked to the back of the car where I couldn't see them anymore. Mom kept giggling in the front seat and my sister kept crying. I tried to calm the baby down, but my own hands were shaking too hard. After what felt like forever, Dad came back to the car and the officer walked back to his patrol car. Dad got in and started the engine without saying anything. The traffic officer let us go with just a warning. I couldn't hear what they talked about at the back of the car, but I knew Dad had done his cop buddy routine and gotten away with it again. Dad drove us back home acting like he'd won some kind of victory. He kept saying, "See, that's how you handle these situations," and Mom laughed and agreed. I sat in the back seat feeling completely crushed. I'd called 911 and reported them and given the address and description, and it still didn't work. Dad's badge had protected him one more time. The officer had seen Mom drinking in the front seat and heard my sister crying and still let us go. I unbuckled my sister from her car seat and carried her inside while my parents celebrated their narrow escape. They popped open more drinks and started talking about leaving first thing tomorrow morning instead. I took my sister upstairs and held her close, knowing that even calling the police wasn't enough to stop what was coming. That night around 11, I heard Dad's keys jingling and Mom asking where he was going. He said she was out of cigarettes and he'd run to the gas station real quick. I stayed in my room with my door cracked open and listened to the car start up in the driveway. The engine sound faded as he drove down the street, and I waited there in the dark, hoping nothing bad would happen. About 10 minutes later, I heard the crash from my window. This loud bang, followed by metal scraping and trash cans rolling across pavement. I ran to look outside and saw Dad's car in the middle of the street with our neighbor's trash cans scattered everywhere. The neighbor came running out of his house yelling something I couldn't hear clearly. Dad didn't even stop to talk or apologize. He just hit the gas and sped away, leaving the trash cans in the road and the neighbor standing there with his phone out. I went back to my room and grabbed my iPod from its hiding spot under my mattress. And then I opened the Notes app and typed out everything that just happened with the exact time showing on my clock. I wrote down the address where the traffic stop happened earlier and the time that officer let us go. Then I wrote about the trash cans and our neighbor's address and what time the crash happened tonight. Saturday morning came and my parents were still asleep from drinking late. I snuck into the bathroom and locked the door so I could use my iPod without anyone seeing. I logged into my email through the browser and started typing a message to Madeline. I told her about the traffic stop on Friday and how the officer let Dad go even though Mom was drinking in the front seat and my sister was crying. I included the exact intersection and the time it happened in case there was dash cam footage or body camera video somewhere. Then I wrote about Dad hitting the trash cans last night and speeding away without stopping. I gave our neighbor's address and said he probably had Ring camera footage of the whole thing. I sent that email to Madeline and then copied the same message and sent it to Sheila at the CPS email address she gave me. My hands were shaking, so bad I had to retype some words 3 times before I got them right. I deleted the sent messages from my email so Dad wouldn't find them if he checked my accounts. Then I cleared the browser history and hid my iPod back in its spot. The weekend dragged by with Dad acting paranoid and Mom drinking even more than usual. Monday afternoon, I was doing homework at the kitchen table when I heard a knock at the front door. Dad answered it, and I heard Sheila's voice saying she was back for her follow-up visit. But then I heard a man's voice too, deeper and more official sounding. I walked to the hallway where I could see the front door, and my stomach did a flip when I saw Dad's face go completely white. Standing next to Sheila was a man in a dark suit with a badge clipped to his belt. Dad stared at him like he'd seen a ghost, and the man held out his hand for a handshake. He introduced himself as Aldous Westbrook from the police department's Internal Affairs Division. Dad shook his hand, but I could see his fingers trembling, and his cop voice came out all forced and fake when he was invited them both inside. Aldous Westbrook sat down on our couch and pulled out a folder, while Sheila stood near the doorway with her clipboard. He explained that IA had received information about potential misconduct involving an officer who may be abusing alcohol and using his badge to avoid consequences for impaired driving. Dad tried to look offended and started saying something about how he'd served the department for 12 years with a clean record. But Westbrook just kept talking in this calm, professional voice about how they take these allegations seriously, no matter who the officer is. He mentioned reviewing traffic stop reports and interviewing witnesses and examining any available video evidence. I watched Dad's face and saw real fear there for the first time ever. His cop buddies weren't in the room, and his badge wasn't protecting him from this man who had the power to end his whole career. Mom came downstairs and tried to act normal, but her words were already slurred from her afternoon drinks. Westbrook took notes about everything he saw, and Sheila asked more questions about our daily routines and who supervised us kids. After they left, Dad became a completely different person. Tuesday morning, he drove me to the school himself instead of letting me take the bus. He walked me right to the front door and told me he'd be picking me up at 3 sharp. When I got in the car that afternoon, he asked who I talked to during the day and what teachers I saw. Wednesday morning, he came into my room while I was getting dressed and started looking through my drawers and under my bed. He said he was making sure I didn't have anything I wasn't supposed to have, like phones or tablets or anything I could use to contact people. I just stood there in my school clothes watching him search through my stuff. He checked my backpack and looked in all the pockets of my jackets hanging in the closet. The SD card stayed hidden in the ripped seam of my mattress where his fingers never reached. Thursday, he drove me to the school again and told me to come straight to the front entrance at dismissal. No stopping to talk to friends or counselors. I felt like a prisoner in my own house with Dad monitoring everything I did. Wednesday afternoon that week, I was at my friend's house doing homework when I looked out the window and saw Mom's car pull up to the stop sign at the main intersection. The light turned red and Mom slowed down, but not enough, her car rolling halfway into the crosswalk before she hit the brakes hard. A car coming from the left had to swerve to avoid her, and I heard the horn blaring from where I stood. Mom drove through once the light changed and turned into the grocery store parking lot 2 blocks away. I told my friend's mom I needed to leave and ran the whole way to the store. When I got there, I saw Mom getting out of her car with my sister in her arms, and she stumbled a little bit as she walked toward the store entrance. The security camera mounted above the door was pointing right at her. I ran up and took my sister from Mom's arms before she could drop her. Mom smiled at me all confused and asked what I was doing here. I said I was just walking by and wanted to help with the shopping. Inside the store, I grabbed a cart and put my sister in the seat part, and told Mom I'd push it. She was weaving between the aisles, picking random things off shelves that we didn't need. I steered us toward the customer service desk where they had a courtesy phone on the wall. I told Mom I needed to call Dad real quick, and she just waved me off and kept looking at cereal boxes. I picked up the phone and dialed Sheila's number that I'd memorized from her card. She answered on the second ring, and I talked quiet so Mom wouldn't hear. I told her Mom just drove drunk to the grocery store and almost ran a red light at 5th and Main. I said we were at the store right now and Mom was clearly drunk and stumbling around with my baby sister. I gave her the store name and address, and Sheila said she'd handle it and told me to stay there with Mom. I hung up and pushed the cart back to where Mom was now looking at frozen dinners. I insisted we walk home instead of drive, and Mom argued, but I wouldn't give in. I held my sister and pushed the cart with one hand, and basically forced Mom to walk the 4 blocks back to our house with me. That evening around 6 o'clock, there was another knock at the door. Mom opened it, and there stood Sheila with Aldous Westbrook right behind her. Dad was still on patrol and wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. Sheila said they needed to do an inspection, and Mom had no choice but to let them in. They walked through every room taking notes and photos. Westbrook found 3 bottles of vodka hidden in the kitchen cabinet behind the cleaning supplies. Sheila checked my sister's room and saw the car seat sitting in the corner with the straps all twisted and buckled wrong. She asked Mom to demonstrate how she installs it, and Mom couldn't even figure out which way it faced. I watched from the hallway as they opened the fridge and saw all the beer and wine bottles taking up half the shelves. Mom tried to explain that the alcohol was just for special occasions, but her hands were shaking, and she kept forgetting what she was saying mid-sentence. Sheila stepped into the hallway and pulled out her phone. She made 3 calls in a row using words that made my chest tight. She kept saying immediate safety concern and emergency placement and supervised visitation only. Aldous Westbrook took photos of everything with his phone, making sure to get clear shots of the bottles and the car seat and Mom's condition. Mom started crying and saying she'd stop drinking right now. She promised she'd never touch another drop. But while she said it, her hands shook, so bad she had to hold them together to make them stop. Her words came out slurred and she couldn't stand still without swaying. Sheila wrote everything down on her forms and made another phone call to someone she called the placement coordinator. Around 7:30, I heard Dad's patrol car pull into the driveway. He walked through the front door still in his uniform and stopped dead when he saw Sheila and Westbrook standing in our living room. His face went red and he started talking loud about how this was harassment and he had rights and they couldn't just barge into his home. But Westbrook didn't move or raise his voice. He just stood there with his arms crossed and his badge visible on his belt. Dad looked at him and seemed to remember that this wasn't some regular cop he could intimidate. Sheila stepped forward with her clipboard and explained in this calm voice that she was invoking emergency custody due to immediate safety concerns. She said my sister and I were being placed in temporary foster care tonight for our protection. Dad started to argue, but Westbrook put his hand up and said the department was placing Dad on immediate administrative leave pending the internal affairs investigation. Everything Dad had built his whole career on was falling apart right there in our living room, and there was nothing his badge could do to stop it. Dad started yelling about how this was all wrong and someone had set him up to make him look bad. He said the whole thing was a setup and none of it was real. Westbrook just stood there quiet and calm and pulled out his phone. He showed Dad something on the screen and mentioned the traffic stop from last Friday, where the officer let Dad go after the badge flash. Then he brought up the neighbor's complaint about the trash cans getting hit last Saturday night. He showed Dad the mechanic report from Julian about the car being sabotaged and how Dad never filed a police report about it. Dad's face went red, and he started to say something, but Westbrook cut him off and said the department was placing him on immediate leave while internal affairs did their investigation. Dad had to hand over his badge and his gun right there in our living room. Sheila made some notes on her clipboard and said she was invoking emergency custody, and we were going into foster care tonight. A different social worker showed up about 20 minutes later, driving a regular car instead of a CPS van. She introduced herself, but I don't remember her name because my brain felt fuzzy and far away. She told me to pack a bag with clothes and anything important I needed. My hands shook so bad I could barely zip my backpack. I grabbed my sister's diaper bag and stuffed it with all her bottles and the formula and her favorite blanket with the purple elephants on it. I made sure to get her pacifiers and the stuffed bear she sleeps with. The social worker helped me carry everything to the car, while Mom cried on the couch, and Dad stood in the doorway watching us with his arms crossed. I buckled my sister into the social worker's car seat, and she smiled at me like nothing was wrong. The drive to the foster home took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. The foster mother met us at the door, and she seemed nice enough. She showed me the bedroom where my sister and I would sleep, and explained the house rules about bedtime and meals. Everything felt weird and wrong, like I was watching it happen to someone else instead of me. That night after my sister fell asleep, Sheila came back to talk to me. I pulled out the SD card I'd been hiding in my mattress and showed her everything I'd collected over the past few weeks. All the photos of empty bottles and the videos I took of my parents drinking before they drove. The voice memos where I described what happened each day. Sheila plugged the SD card into her laptop and went through every single file while I explained why I sabotaged the car. She asked me questions about how long this had been going on and whether anyone had ever gotten hurt. I told her about the T-bone accident and how Dad lied in the police report. She wrote everything down and said this documentation was really important for the case. She explained that my parents would have to do substance abuse tests and go to parenting classes. They'd have to prove they could stay sober before the court would even think about letting us come home. She said this whole process could take months or maybe even longer than that. Any visits we had with them would be supervised by CPS staff at their office. The next day, Westbrook showed up at the foster home to interview me separately. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and explained that the internal affairs investigation had limits. He said he couldn't promise any specific outcome because police departments often protect their own. But he seemed really concerned about what I'd reported, and he asked me to tell him everything I remembered about Dad using his badge to get out of trouble. I told him about all the times we got pulled over, and Dad would flash his badge and suddenly everything was fine. About the accident where the other driver's arm got broken and Dad blamed it on them. Westbrook took notes and said he'd follow up on the traffic stops to see if there was dash cam footage. A few days later, we had our first supervised visit at the CPS office. Mom showed up with her eyes all red from crying. She kept apologizing and promising she'd already stopped drinking, and everything would be different now. She tried to hold my sister, but her hands were shaking really bad. My sister started crying because Mom's grip was too tight and shaky. Sheila sat in the corner taking notes, and I saw her write something about Mom showing signs of withdrawal. Mom kept saying she just needed one more chance and she'd prove she could do better. but I'd heard that before like 100 times. 2 weeks later, we all had to go to court. Dad sat on one side of the courtroom with some guy in a suit who was his union rep. He stared at me the whole time like he was trying to make me scared. Mom sat on the other side crying into tissues. The judge was this older woman who looked tired and annoyed. She read through all of Sheila's reports and looked at some of the evidence from my SD card. Then she ordered both my parents to do random drug and alcohol testing whenever CPS asked. She said Dad had to cooperate fully with the internal affairs investigation. She ordered us to stay in foster care and said we'd have another hearing in a few months to see if anything had changed. After the hearing, Sheila took me to a private room, and I finally admitted that I was the one who sabotaged the car. I told her I was scared they'd drive us into the desert and we'd die out there. Sheila was quiet for a minute, just looking at me. Then she said I probably saved my sister's life, and maybe saved other people on the road that day too. She said what I did was dangerous, and I should have told an adult sooner, but she understood why I felt like I had no choice. A few days after that, Madeline came to visit me at the foster home. We sat in the backyard and talked about my schoolwork and how I was handling everything. She said it was normal to feel confused and scared and angry all at the same time. She gave me the name and number of a therapist who works with kids from families with substance abuse problems. She set up appointments for me twice a week starting the next Monday. A month into placement, Sheila called to give me an update on my parents. Mom had enrolled in some outpatient treatment program where she was supposed to go 3 times a week, but she missed her second session, and they were threatening to kick her out of the program. Dad was appealing his leave through the police union and trying to get his badge back. Sheila said the system moves really slow, and real change takes time if it happens at all. She said not to get my hopes up about going home anytime soon. The weeks turned into months, and my sister and I got used to the foster home schedule. Every morning, the foster mom made breakfast, and my sister sat in her high chair eating cereal while I got ready for school. Nobody drove us anywhere with drinks in their hands. Nobody swerved between lanes or ran red lights or crashed into mailboxes. The foster mom buckled my sister's car seat correctly every single time and drove the speed limit with both hands on the wheel. It felt weird at first because I kept waiting for something bad to happen, but nothing ever did. We had supervised visits with Mom and Dad every Thursday afternoon at the CPS office. They'd show up and hug us and tell us how much they missed us and promise they were doing better now. Mom would say she hadn't touched alcohol in weeks, and Dad would talk about the classes he was taking and how he was going to get his badge back soon. But then I'd notice Mom's hands shaking or smell something on Dad's breath that wasn't just coffee. They'd make big promises about getting us back home by Christmas or maybe New Year's, and how everything would be different this time. I stopped believing the words after the third visit. Sheila taught me to watch what people actually do instead of listening to what they say they're going to do. Mom missed 2 of her treatment sessions. Dad got caught drinking at a barbecue with his cop buddies. The promises kept coming, but the actions never matched up. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night seeing Mom swerving across lanes with my sister's car seat sliding in the back. I see Dad's one eye closed while he drives and the red light getting closer and the crash happening all over again. The foster mom gave me a nightlight and said, "Bad dreams are normal when you've been through scary stuff." Some mornings my sister wakes me up babbling in her crib and I go get her before anyone else is awake. I change her diaper and bring her to the kitchen and put her in the high chair. She smiles at me with her 4 little teeth and bangs her spoon on the tray. She doesn't remember the car rides or the drinking or any of the dangerous stuff. She's safe now, and that's what matters. Telling the truth was scary, and the system doesn't fix everything perfectly, but my sister is alive and fed, and nobody's driving drunk with her in the back seat anymore. Whatever happens next with Mom and Dad, I know keeping her safe was the right choice even when it was the hardest thing I ever did.